Welcome back, everyone, to Creator in Conversation. I'm your host, Owen Macaulay. Since 2011, I've been making comics, I've been teaching how to make comics, and this podcast, by extension, is allowing us to share with you, the audience, some insights from leading industry experts. And you don't get a bigger expert than today's guest, which is Mr. Paul Levitz. Paul was the president and publisher at DC Comics. He was the one who oversaw the purchasing of the Charlton characters, which of course led to Watchmen as well, during the UK invasion of creators with the likes of Alan Moore. Paul was also at the heart of the purchase of WildStorm, which was of course Jim Lee's company. He founded under the Image banner, and to this day Jim Lee remains in one of the most senior positions within DC Comics. In today's conversation, we begin in a very interesting topic, such as how our stories help to shared interesting stories help to bring us together regardless of our different backgrounds. We talk about the contributions by Mr. Will Eisner as well, and from there we talk about Paul's time writing the Legion of Superheroes as well. And it's by no surprise that we talk a little bit of how Paul's teacher for English was actually Frank McCourt of Angela's Ashes fame, and pretty much I think it would be fair to say he shares the Irish self-effacing manner when it comes to describing one's own contributions, as Mr. Levitz's run on Legion of Superheroes was quite significant and very impactful to this day. We also get to talk to Paul a little bit about if he's excited to check out the new Superman film coming up as well. And of course we talk shop about what's it like teaching in the field of comic books also. So sit back, relax and enjoy this episode of Creator in Conversation with Mr. Paul Levitz. Mr. Paul Levitz, thank you so much for joining us here in Creator in Conversation. I hope you're keeping well.
I'm doing fine. Pleasure to be with you and to listen to the brogue.
I even have the paddy cap on, which it looks like an affectation, but it's honestly, it's been one of those days. I was like, I either come on camera with a mop of crazy hair, or I just go full caricature. So have you any Irish connection yourself? I think briefly before the madness of lockdown, we were having a preliminary conversation regarding Dublin Comic Con, and I think Mr. Frank McCourt's name came up in conversation.
I was lucky enough to have McCourt as my English teacher for a good chunk of my high school time, and to stay friendly with him for the rest of his days, as much as former students pester their teachers and say, "Hi, I'm doing okay. Oh wow, you're doing that? That's pretty fucking cool." He set a high standard of accomplishment, obviously.
Yeah.
I have to confirm my speaking language. Yes, this is English Brooklynese version. And I had a dear friend growing up, Liam O'Connor, whose family was Irish. Irish immigrants to the U.S. Not most of them not Ireland born, but close enough that there was a little bit of the lovely brogue around the house every now and then.
It does seem to carry the Irish communities. I always loved it when I was reading about the work of Will Eisner. He always kind of spoke about his own teenage years, and he said everything was so ghettoized. Like there was a ghetto for the Irish, the Italians, for the Jewish community, and it seems to be we all seem to just travel in groups and communities.
Well, affiliation is a very powerful tool. In New York, there's a wonderful old book, The Melting Pot, which talks about how each of the groups, the original 4 or 5 groups that formed the culture of New York up to through the 60s, traveled in very specific paths. And someone would crack into a profession or a line of work or a retail line, and this works. Well, let me tell my cousin Fred. Let me tell my cousin Augustus. Let me tell my cousin Cynthia. So you got an awful lot of Jewish teachers and an awful lot of Irish cops, and it just the dynamics work that way. Of course, religion played a part, because certainly in the first generations that came over, here's a here's a Catholic church with a priest who sounds like the old country. Here's a Jewish temple that is observing the same way that it did in the old city that many of us came from. So you cluster from all of that. Um,
And
that
what's
has good and bad effects. You know, when you mentioned Will, I forgive him largely the sin of Ebony White on the grounds that he grew up in a cluster of Jewish immigrant families. And when he created Ebony, he was maybe 20, 21 years old. Yeah, not that that's too young to know better, but he really hadn't had any experience of people of color at that point. So he fell into the stereotypes that were prevalent in the culture. Um,
that's a very interesting point because prior to setting up the academy, I had spent a decade teaching in animation, and I taught a subject called animation history and principles. And there was a subject, a class we did called critical issues, and Ebony White and Will Eisner did come up because in what's interesting today when we have this type of discourse is people are very quick we not to justify or to defend, but it's have they checked to see what has the individual, the author, actually said themselves? Because Will actually addressed this in his own words, and exactly as you put it, um, today with our smartphones in our pockets, like even now we're talking like across
right.
the Atlantic, we're so connected. Back then, it's insane. You could be in the same city, but you just would walk past someone. You would only have a perception for the outside looking in. It's incredible how we've changed.
Well, you could be in New York. You certainly could be in the same neighborhood,
Hmm.
and you didn't cross very much.
Hmm.
The class I went to in elementary school, I don't think had an Irish kid in it. We had Jews and we had a few Italians and we had one or two African American kids who were bussed in from another neighborhood because the city school system was beginning to have a conscience and trying trying to desegregate what had evolved somewhat naturally and somewhat because of legal structures that were put in place and horrible things like that.
Hmm.
Um, but you connecting with an Irish kid happened because we both loved comics. He went to high school, a Catholic high school, a block away from my house, but I hadn't known any kid who went to the Catholic school. But we began to communicate because we had something that we cared about together, and became good friends from that. And that's one of the joys I think of all creative forms. They have the ability to break down these barriers and to create common respect, common affection when you treat people properly in them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the stories which help us to connect. I believe in the graphic novel trade for Kingdom Come. Elliot S. Maggin, who wrote the novelization, also wrote the introduction for the collected edition. And he had a wonderful phrase, which I actually quoted myself when I was making my college application, which was how the stories we leave behind, the markers of a culture, that's what makes us who we are. And Dan Slott had a great notion as well when he was on Spider-Man. He introduced and made so many new characters, but also characters of different ethnicities and backgrounds. And he would always describe how when he would go to a convention, people would come up and cosplay these characters, but for now they would see themselves within the story, within the characters, that representation. Um, it's curious because with so many Jewish creators within comics, for so long. Like a lot of the characters, like Ben Grimm, the Thing, was the most
Mhm.
perhaps prominently known Jewish hero for so long. But he also had that. He was also the monster, the kind of self-loathing aspect to him in the early years of the comics, for sure. I often wondered if there was any suggestion of the creators wrestling with identity, or is it just
It's a good question.
coincidence?
Yeah, I think it's probably coincidence. I think Jack saw himself as a tough guy and was in his youth, certainly both in the army and occasionally after it. Um, I think it's probably coincidence from that. But
Yeah.
what I was going to recount from my own experience, the strip that I'm best known for, and the run that marks my career best, is a long run on Legion of Superheroes.
Hmm.
And for those of your listeners who aren't familiar, because it's not as popular today as it was once upon a time, it's a bunch of teenage kids with superpowers saving the universe in 1,000 years in the future. I didn't create it, but I wrote it for a long time. Well, maybe 20 years after my run on it, I've noticed a pattern at comic conventions that a disproportionate number of the people who were coming up with stacks of the Legion enthusiastically to have them signed were gay guys. There are no gay characters in the Legion. It was before, in the years we're talking about, it was before you were allowed to do that in comics. There's one mildly present and obvious lesbian romance towards the end of the run, but you got to look with a magnifying glass. Um, okay, so I've told this story before. I told it as a graduation speech for a college that I teach at when they were honoring me with an honorary degree last year. After I saw this pattern, I took Phil Jimenez to lunch. Phil is a writer, an artist, a very bright man, a Legion fan of my generation, of the generation that was reading my work, and a gay man. He's out, has been, I think, is basically his whole adult life. Phil, what the fuck? Um, and he said, well, you had a world where orange and green and blue people were getting along with the white people, and we kind of figured if they were all getting along, we'd be able to get along too. And the costumes were pretty hot. I had no responsibility for the costumes in the process. Phil talked about this in a DC Pride book that he did, and he made the joke that this material was being done by the two straightest guys he knew, me and Keith Giffen. I don't I don't know if that's a compliment or not in the process, but the story you tell is the story you mean to tell, but it's also the story that's in your head about how you see the whole world unconsciously, whether it's that we'll all get along sometime in the future because otherwise we all get blown up. Um, but it's also the story the readers bring to it based on what's going on in their life. And that story is as important and as valid as the two stories you bring to it. But it's your responsibility to tell your stories as honestly as you can and hope that those connections come through right.
Yeah. That's amazing, and it's so powerful when, as you were putting it, the stories connect audibility just for people, because that's in a moment what they really need. We do a lot in animation about the age ghetto and how animation was considered just a medium for children, and by extension, comics for so long were as well. But when you look towards the East in Japan, not so much. But of course, look at the outcome of the bombing and the war, and people just, this is entertainment. They didn't really care about the manner in which it was presented. It was visual entertainment. And here in Ireland, we have a really proud tradition of sequential storytelling in the form of the ancient high crosses, which essentially are three-dimensional stone carvings of sequences from the Bible. But
Hmm.
these convey en
Wow.
masse like a story, and it's so interesting. And then if you go to Harry Clark, which is further along the timeline, but he was a brilliant stained glass artist.
Okay.
But then stained glass imagery existed in our churches for those who couldn't read because literacy
Sure.
wasn't as high. So
Oh, story.
yeah, and we have a sometimes lecturer here and a guest of the podcast, Paul Bulger, but he raised a really interesting point because I think he did his dissertation akin to something based on comics of visual communication, and he made a really startling point to me in the podcast, which was, up until the time before Shakespeare, everyone privileged visual communication, like imagery. Even the Aztec organization, very visual based. But as soon as you get to Shakespeare, then it seemed to be the written word was held in higher esteem, because they say, oh, it's because you're building it all in your own mind and the accomplishment to it. But if you do look at the timeline, there's such a stark contrast of, but the imagery that was used, visual communication was so key to it. But with
Interesting,
Lee, sorry, go ahead.
interesting way of looking at it. I had never focused on that timeline.
Yeah, no, it really is, and it's something I wouldn't have myself. But that's what's great about doing the podcast. That these are the type of conversations and points that have
Hmm.
been coming up, and it just goes to show conversation or sharing stories along the way. That's really what it's all about. And comics, uh, by its very process, so collaborative, and hopefully that's something that we maintain, because obviously AI has been proven to be one of the most, disruptive technologies across so many mediums. Um, what's interesting, I find at the moment, is that there seems to be no one rushing to get an AI generated comic. I think the collector's mentality of the art being produced, and the artist itself, there's so much built around the conventions, the collector's mentality, the craft itself, the collaboration. I see it as being something that's going to be here to stay. I don't see it being replaced. But from your perspective, has this been anything that's given you any pause to think or reflect on, or has it been something that's just been an aside to what you're doing at the moment?
I mean, I see bits of it. I teach at college and graduate programs. There's a lot of discussion there, both of the study of the constructive use of AI and the concern, you know, are all the students just going to be turning in papers that they do on AI and not thinking in the process?
Mhm.
Um, so I hear the conversations. To me, it's a tool. Any
Mhm.
tool can be used for good purposes or bad purposes. We've certainly had enough science fiction stories depicting the dangers of something resembling AI. I'm not sure I'll live to see the answer to this question. Um, I don't see that it's got any potential in the future I can envision to replace human creativity.
Mhm.
Everything that I've seen so far is so imitative and such a sloppy assemblage.
Yeah.
Please go out and make Frankenstein's monster instead of making a human being. Yes, it sort of has a head and the appropriate number of limbs, but is anybody really going to notice it as human, and is it going to interact in any sort of human fashion? Yeah, we're not seeing that yet, and maybe we never will. I don't know.
Yeah. And to bring it back to, speaking of future and sci-fi, bring it back to Legion. We have a couple of props that we made for the campus here. We made a foam giant Penny and Joker card, evocative of the Batcave. The first thing I moved in, I was like, this is so unnecessary, but at the same time necessary to have. But we actually have a little display box with a Legion ring in it as well, that we keep in the bookcase. And I think you definitely hold the biggest book that we have, the big giant history of
Option book.
DC.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that must have been. What was the process putting that together? Was that just a labor of love, or was that intense research, or a mixture of both?
The project started several years before, when DC saw we were coming up on our 75th anniversary, and the team I had, who handled what we defined as licensed publishing, books and things that we did not publish ourselves, but based on our intellectual properties that we controlled, went out and bid out who's going to do the book that celebrates it. And Toshin won that foot race. And the Toshin team went out and began assembling the visuals, because they're a very visual publisher.
Mhm.
But the team had not been able to find a writer to do the written portion of the book.
Mhm.
Um, and that was the case when I was leaving the desk. They turned around and said, "Well, you know all this stuff. Why don't you do it?" Um, and it was a wonderful opportunity for me because it reminded everyone that I was, in fact, a writer, not just an executive. And I did know that stuff. I mean, yes, there were things I had to research in the process, but the actual written portion of it is really a monograph. It's 35, 40,000 words. It's nowhere, the weight of the book is the visuals.
Mhm.
Um, and I was able to dive in and, yeah, okay, let me double check that thing, when exactly that happened, or whether that happened the way everybody said it did. Do little bits of research here and there, but over the course of, I guess, about 6 months, I was able to complete the necessary work.
No, it's a great testament to the just the history of DC. I have a nephew who's 6, a niece who's 3, but when they were even younger, I remember taking it out to show them because of the gold file paper they did for the
Yeah.
ages, like gold, silver, and modern. It's just it's a wonderful, wonderful text to have. And you mentioned yourself going back to being a writer as well, like to remind that you are a writer. Uh, During your tenure at DC, were there moments where you found you wish you were being driven more in the executive direction, where you kind of longed or pined to be going more towards the creative? Or was that just something which you're just happy being around the craft and the medium itself?
Well, it's always more fun to be part of a world that you love,
Mhm.
whatever role you're going to have in it. But writing used to be sort of a moonlighting job. The comics evolved out of the pulps in America, and the tradition was, oh, and I've got a job for you, pays $5 a week. I know you can't live on $5 a week, but you're going to edit Batman, and I edit Superman. You can sell me a Superman story every week. That'll pay you another $5, and that's enough that you'll be able to live. By the way, I'm going to sell you a Batman story because they're not paying me enough either. Everybody was moonlighting at something in my generation. We fixed that over the years, but I got to a point in my career where the salary was more than enough to live on very comfortably, and my kids were at the time 2 and 4, and I wanted the weekends back. I wanted to be on the soccer field with them, refereeing or just shouting, or taking my daughter to dance class or things, and that meant not doing very much writing for 20 years. Um, I think my skills suffered somewhat from being away from it that long, uh, but
It's,
I,
it's
I
like
got,
going to the gym, I suppose. It's like anything; you gotta
yeah.
get back into the swing of it.
Well, there's two things to it. One, certainly is true about the muscle memory of doing it, but it's also that the world changes around you, and the
Mm.
tastes change and the styles change. And if you're working in a creative field continually, a lot of people don't manage to change with it, but the really great people manage to evolve with the culture that changes around them. But if you're not working actively, no matter how much you're listening to the culture and paying attention to it as an individual, it's not the same thing as trying to capture that voice. And I think that's much harder to make the transition back. Or I'm writing myself an excuse note. Not sure which.
Uh, and you're saying you're teaching as well. How have you found that particular role? Has that been something that's probably been with your tenure at DC? I imagine that's similar to a teacher as well, because you're guiding Sony Productions and creative teams. Have you noticed much crossover between your two roles?
Uh, Karen Berger commented, "I always was pedantic." Um, Bless her. Um, there's parts about being a leader in any organization that's similar to being a teacher. You're managing personalities and human beings and trying to work with that kind of diversity. Um, there are great differences, I think, in teachers who teach different kinds of subjects and different age groups.
Mm.
I do a lot of my teaching with graduate students in Pace. Pace University has a master's in publishing program. Like the students that you would have at your academy, they're there because they want to be.
Yeah.
And you don't have any of the teacher as cop challenges that
Yeah.
are, God knows how you teach in middle school without a taser.
Yeah.
Um, but I do a lot of undergraduate teaching as well. And there you get a mixture of kids who wanted to learn about the subject or who wandered in because it was at the right time on their schedule and it fulfilled a what we call in America a distribution requirement. You have to take 3 English electives or whatever, and it's I can take Shakespeare, I can take Irish literature, or I
Mhm.
can take graphic novels. Ooh, graphic novels sounds easiest. Terrific. I'll take that. I don't read them, but maybe it's interesting. Um, and that's an interesting mix of kids. And if you can, some leave loving graphic novels much more when they're finished. Some just pass the time, but every now and then you get a kid who really does interesting things and goes onward, and that's a great deal of fun.
Excellent. No, it's my own experience has been interesting because I set up a small publishing company called Light and Strike Comics when I was 19, and
Wow.
we just did some indie comics, the small press.
Mhm.
But then we got into a little bit of licensing, like Sherlock Holmes before he's public domain, and we reprint and do some original stuff with King Feature Syndicate, like the Phantom and stuff.
Hmm.
But that put me on the radar for the head of programs at the time, Dave Williams, for a college called Pulse College, to go in and teach business and write business because I hadn't formally at that stage studied business myself, but uh, because I was a creative and I was going through like, here's how to incorporate the business,
Yeah.
here's how you do your cash flow. He's like, you're creative, but you've done all the business stuff. I have all these video game students who just cannot crack that. And you have to go in and teach them. It's like a lens, you just use the business for what it is that to achieve the goals that you want. But it's been so interesting because that what you were saying with the undergraduates, you do see the difference between, particularly mature students. It could be undergraduate, but mature evening students, you see a big
Sure.
difference. But once there's high school to undergrad, it's a different ball game. I envy my peers, my fellow teachers, and that level for sure. And uh, for yourself, was comics always going to be the mission for you to try and break into, or did you have other career goals onto? Was this a coincidence that's something you love, that you're a fan for, that you found work in, or was it the goal?
Complete accident of where I was born and the moment in time. Pretty much all the kids in New York City who really loved comics in my generation got a chance to work in the field. All of the comics in America were coming out of the New York metro area pretty much.
Mhm.
A generation of the early creators who'd really built the comic book field, who'd been active in the comic strip world, were aging out. So seats were opening up. And if you hung around enough and you said, I like this stuff, I speak in full sentences, I'm not an axe murderer, you probably got a shot at doing something. A lot of kids drifted off. Either they didn't have what it takes to deal with a creative field, uh, or they didn't have the temperament, or they found something they thought was better to do. I was going to be a science kid or a manager in a technological world, what today you would think of as probably STEM or tech. I thought I would be a business guy in that. That's what I was going to school to do. But I loved comics. I had the opportunity to work in it to pay my way through school. Um, Comic book business was not healthy in America in those years. This
Mm.
was the end of the newsstand era. Okay, but it'll be fun to be part of this world, to have a taste of it, and I'll make some money. That'll be great. And then I just fell deeper and deeper into it and got more opportunity and said, all right, I'll give this a chance for a few years. And a few years turned into a few decades, and I enjoyed myself. And I never got bored. I was lucky enough that my job continued to change and mutate because the field continued to change, the culture continued to change in its view of what comics were. The particular company I was at had a lot of opportunities because of the properties that it controlled. Um, and not getting bored was one of the really important things to me.
You were among some of the probably still hold a record as like one of the youngest executives, I think, in DC history starting out as well. Was that ever a challenge did you find for yourself to be able to have, the seniors recognize you or to, accept
Sure.
what you had to say of substance? Yeah.
Sure. As simple as inherited one woman when I got my stripes as a manager working for me who quit on the spot.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
she was, I don't think she was my mother's age, but she was much closer to my mother's age than mine. And the idea of working for me just was completely intolerable after 30 or 40 years of having worked with one of the long-standing DC executives who had been fired a few years before. Um, and certainly there were issues about achieving credibility with some of the older execs around. Um, but Jeanette was only a decade older than I was. I mean, big decade. The difference between being in your 20 when she got there, I was 19. She was 28. When she got to be president, she was still 37, I guess.
Mm.
Uh, I was maybe younger. No, no, it's 30, 33. I would have been 24. Um, that's a big gap. But DC wasn't a very important part of the parent company. So handing that much responsibility to a couple of kids, okay, how much harm can they do? And not a tremendous amount of belief in how much good we could do, but we kind of showed them on that and got more responsibility as a result. Worked out.
It definitely was like under your tenure, one of your lasting legacies with DC seems to have been the IP approach, like the development of new ideas at DC. It wasn't always about a spreadsheet with the immediate sales of comics per se, as it were. This is an idea that could be the next blockbuster film or video game or the potential for where this character could go. Because what's interesting is the first time you came on my radar was actually from the Batman Begins DVDs, the extras in
Oh,
it. I love those interviews and behind the scenes, and but you were there. You were talking all about the subject matter, the original source material, but again, that connection that you see between the source material to the development into other media is great because now, as you mentioned, when you broke into DC, it seems to be it was the right time, the right place. Now, if you want to break in, you have to be an Oscar winner, I think, like for a screenplay you
whole,
wrote.
whole different. I very early on began describing DC to our owners as a self-financing R&D unit. We send home a little bit of money every year, not very material by corporate standards, but honest profitability. We're improving that. But we have several wonder drugs where we work consistently to try and keep them fresh, patentable, copyrightable, culturally appropriate, and we pour money into developing new things which we hope will be wonder drugs for the future. And a fair number of things that were developed in our time turned out to have real value. Most didn't, but that's the usual way in any creative industry. But our batting average, I think, was as good as any company has ever had about developing things internally and with freelance talent. Um, it's R&D is always a very hit and miss process,
Mhm.
and if you accept that you don't really know what will come out of the laboratory. Some of the best proposals we saw yielded comics that no one wanted to read, and some of the worst proposals turned into things that were interesting. Um, it has to gestate, and you have to see what happens.
It was really during that time and approach that what we consider the modern graphic novel, the kind of trade collection, that really came to prominence as a result of a lot of that. And that's pretty much the large stake of the industry today. Although you still have the Wednesday Warriors picking up the weekly issues, the general appeal for many people at the bookshops and the trades. And now, particularly here in Ireland, when I grew up, unknown to me, there was a comic shop, but I didn't find it till much later. It was newsagents. So we would get Panini would do collections, Titans would do collections and stuff. But then bookshops would order in perhaps some of the US trades as well. Um, During your time, you oversaw some significant acquisitions with DC. Correct me if I'm wrong, but would have the acquisition of the Charlton characters, would that have been during your
And
tenure as well?
that was a project I did. Um,
Okay.
yeah, we acquired some things that existed, not too many, but a couple.
Mhm.
Um, and we built a lot of stuff fresh. But you talk about the graphic novel. That was a project of many years to build that. I certainly don't claim, to be the person who made it happen,
Mhm.
but we worked very hard at a number of things that were important to the growth of the graphic novel in America. Um, Getting the bookstore kind of space, getting the things like a graphic novel bestseller list that
Mhm.
became well known, changing the distribution system so that they were more readily available to the stores and could be kept in stock, and really promoting that format over a very long period of time.
No, it's great. And at the same time, as well as the development of that publishing approach, a lot of the talent as well. You would have been there during the time of well, I think they call it now the UK invasion, is it?
I think it's still the British, called the British invasion of America. That may be unfair to the Irish and Scotch contributors to the process, but
Uh, and what was that like? What brought what was happening in the British comic scene? How did that come onto your radar? Because I can understand American comics in the UK because it's crazy. There used to be a little comic market that happened here every Saturday, or every second Saturday or so in the Dublin City Centre. And you'll find like hidden gold, like this is like a really old Batman or a Daredevil one or something crazy. And the old man selling it would be like, well, they were used as ballast on the ships coming over. I'm like, what? And it's just like you'd see stuff like small fortune and comics there before you. But I can understand how the US comics made its way over this side of the Atlantic. But what brought the UK creators then onto your radar then?
well, when I was doing fanzines as a kid, um, fanzine I did was primarily sort of a TV guide. That's an anachronistic term now, but what's coming out next month, and here's a log line about it. Here's who the creators are. Um, there was a fanzine being published in England called Comic Media by Nick Landau, who went on to be Titan, and his partner Richard Burton. And they wrote me and said, "Hey, this is cool. Can we run people here are interested in American comics? Can we run some of the news from your fanzine and our fanzine?" Sure. Um, and Nick and I set up a lively trade where he would find Michael Moorcock books that hadn't been published in the US and send them over to me. And this is before there was a direct sales world. I'd pluck 25 copies of Shazam #1 off newsstands and ship them over to him for him to sell in the UK. This is pre Forbidden Planet, pre Titan distributors, but he was already an entrepreneurial soul. Um, well, as a result of this, I was sort of connected to the British material because both Nick and Richard went to work at 2000 AD, went to work at Marvel UK at a later point. and I was reading their work because they'd send it over and being introduced to all of these interesting strips and creators. And that's began the connective process for me, at least.
Mhm.
Joe Staten, who was a dear friend and collaborator of mine, we did the Huntress stories together with Bob Layton, um, was going to England for the summer. His wife was a school teacher at the time. We can, this will be school's out. We can go anywhere, but I need studio space because I'm still going to have to be working on my art. Do you have any bright ideas, Paul? Oh, let me talk to Richard. Richard said, "Oh, I think Brian Boland has a spare drawing board in his studio." So, we made the marriage. Joe sat next to Brian for a couple months. That connected Brian. Brian began to do some covers for DC, and it all went downhill from there. Uh,
That's amazing onto it. Because yeah, it's just so much from it. Like as we think, as you mentioned, the bestseller lists as well, and such that would have come from it. A lot of the material, like Watchmen, for example, was listed not just for comics, but it's like Times 100
I
greatest novels of all time. So
I
yeah.
think of 20th century, not of all time, but
Oh, 20th century. Oh, there we go.
we'll take it in.
And further along the timeline, probably going into the 90s, could be 8000s as well. Obviously, Jim Lee is so like present, prominent in DC now, doing Hush 2, and he's one of the main head honchos at DC today. But Wildstorm, then that would have been another acquisition time. Were you involved into that project?
Yeah,
That must have been a very interesting development as well, just because of the 90s and the change that came with Image, and then suddenly Jim Lee was so well known for X-Men with Marvel. Then suddenly he had Wildstorm. Then he's at DC as well. That must have been just from memories from that. How or what can you say, I suppose, from the time of that? Was that just a
you know,
time
we
that made sense?
the Image material was succeeding in the marketplace. We didn't have any editors who were particularly good at that flavor of ice cream.
Mhm.
We had taken a run at Malibu when it was up for sale, and were outbid by Marvel, and we were sad about that. John Nee, who was Jim's partner in crime, and Wildstorm walks into my office one day, says, "Hey, Jim's thinking of selling out. Are you guys interested?" And I knew Jim's work, but I didn't know Jim particularly well. We
Mhm.
went through a process of learning what Wildstorm was, and then we went through the more complicated process of convincing the parent corporation to spend the money on it.
Mm.
Charlton Charlton characters were dead characters. The
Mhm.
amount of money that was involved in buying that was something that I didn't need anybody's permission to do, as long
Okay.
as that fit within my budget, which it was rounding error of some line of the budget, not anything that material. Great, go do whatever the hell you want to do. I didn't have to tell anybody before or after. Probably had to tell Jeanette so she knew what was going on, but not to get authorization. Wildstorm was real money,
Mm.
and that meant that we had to go before the Warner Brothers senior management team and convince them that this was sane,
Yeah.
um, and that was an interesting process.
Yeah, it's this one of those kind of milestone moments in comics history as well, when it something like that happens, because it's not something that you see. I suppose the closest something like that ever happening in recent time would have been when Robert Kirkman became a partner at Image, but that's kind of different. You don't usually see much in the way of those type of acquisitions or change. No, but I suppose when Disney bought Marvel, that probably would have been the
Yeah, that's a somewhat larger one.
yeah, yeah, that
We
one
didn't pay,
probably
we
is a
didn't pay $4 billion for Wildstorm. It was fine, but you got to take a bunch of zeros off of that.
I don't know. Check for inflation with the way the economy's going these days.
That's a whole other story.
um, Going back just a little bit to Legion as well. The So, what was your introduction to the characters? Because as you mentioned, you didn't create the Legion of Superheroes. Were you always a fan before
Uh,
you picked up? Yeah.
The Legion was the first comic book series I collected.
Mm.
Um, and as I said, the Weisinger Superman material was my way into comics,
Hmm.
the series, and they would pop up there occasionally. And there were a few stores existent at that point where you could get a back issue comic
Yeah.
cheap, 5 cents, 10 cents, because they were used. But I began to fill in the Legion collection, and then, of course, discovered conventions and all the rest of that. So this was something I had loved, and I got a chance to write it the first time. Didn't do too great a job of it in the '70s. I was a little too young, overcommitted. Um, some of the stories hold up. A lot of them really don't. Um, and had to give up the assignment when we went through a cutback and were juggling things.
Mm.
What became known as the DC implosion. And a couple of years after that, Mike Barr was editing the book, and he asked me if I'd like to come back to it. And I thought about it and said, "Yeah, I love them, but I'm coming back. I'm going to do it right this time." And I committed myself and went 100 issues without a fill-in.
Wow. That's a testament because you very rarely see that now. Such a run of that duration. It's lucky if you get six 6 issue miniseries out the gate.
It was a
Uh,
different time, but still.
what's very interesting with the Legion of Superheroes is how it wasn't always there at the start, but retroactively it became such an important part to Superman's early development, like in terms, I suppose, from Silver Age, Bronze Age development, and then it was during the John era that you notice how important it was because you have such the optimistic hero, and of course he's optimistic because he's seeing the future as well as is one aspect
It's
to
interesting way to
it.
I never thought of that. Yeah, but he was optimistic before he saw the future, I think.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, no, absolutely. He had that inherent to him, but it's also just that kind of a ambassador for the future as well. Because at the time of recording, DC seemed to be teasing another go at Legion one more time, or a different take. I think they're tying it in with Absolute. We'll see what brings.
I'll see.
But what's so fascinating with the Legion story is you kind of had two doors as a comic reader, which was X-Men or Legion. That's often how many people say. Like, how would you did you ever come across that?
I think Teen Titans held its own against X-Men better than Legion did, but Titans and Legion on our side of the street certainly were the drugs of choice.
Very interesting. That's actually, now you say with Titans, I could see that fitting as well and blending with the X-Men counted. But yeah, I know a lot of I think it depends on which side of the 70s you were a reader. Because depending, it was like it would either go Legion or Titans, depending with regards to the X-Men. But at the moment, do you have any upcoming projects, any passion projects that you would like to revisit? Are you currently in development? Anything that you can talk about at the moment?
I'm just fiddling around at this point. I did a lovely little comic. The New York City Department of Education does comics for the school system,
Oh, great.
and I did a comic that we entitled "Sketches on the Sidewalk." It's basically the story of the Jewish comic creators of that first generation,
Oh, great.
and I got to work with Joe Staten again. We've done over 50 stories together, but we hadn't done one in many years because I hadn't been active. So that
Mhm.
was fun. I'm working on another one for them right now. Um, there are some books of comics history that I'm waiting on a publisher to sign off on.
Oh,
We'll see,
great.
we'll see if I get to do those. The teaching is the big project, and just it's a slower pace at this point with all this gray in the hair. Uh,
How do you find the grading process when it comes to teaching? I always ask this whenever I have a teacher on because I personally hate it because it's just the trying to. I think when I have the page before me and I try to break down, give advice, I prefer meeting with the student. That's how I did it when I was in college. My lecturer would kind of talk to me. I find that
with the
formative
British,
feedback.
well, isn't that the classic British like Oxford? I think grading is very arbitrary. I think if you're teaching math, grading isn't arbitrary.
Hmm.
There's a right answer, wrong answer, and many subjects work that way. When you're teaching writing, when you're teaching literature, what mood the reader is in, it has as much effect perhaps as what the writer has done. But I try to be straightforward about it. Um, when I'm teaching classes like writing or graphic novel as literature, the question is, did you try? You're taking a writing class. I'm not grading you on whether or not you're going to win a Pulitzer someday. I'm
Hmm.
grading you on a scale of, did you put honest effort into it? Did you do something the best that you could do? And if you do honest effort, you should be able to get a very good grade in the class.
Yeah.
And if you do an honest effort and you do something good, really good, you should be able to get a spectacular grade in the class.
Yeah, it's all subjective at the end of the day. That's what drives me mad is when I try to. I don't know if you've ever gone through the validation process. It might be called something different, but where you design a course from scratch to get the approval by the award body
Yeah,
to get the credit. Yeah, oh my goodness, that puts years on me when every time I have to do something like it because you'd be explaining. I remember once um, I won't name names, but I was developing a program, and there was a comic book module within it. It was sequential art design and production, and the program development was animation, and um, it got approved. But one of the the panelists, the advice that came back was, well, we think this is all good, but maybe take out that sequential art module and throw in an extra storyboarding class. And I'm like, well, don't get me wrong, storyboarding is important. It is an important process, particularly in film and animation. But with sequential art, there's so much more to the visual narrative. But the irony to it all was that I don't know, about 3 or 4 years later, the organization asked me back when I set up the academy to go to be a panelist to help something else be approved. So I wasn't putting something forward. I
because
was being a panelist. But I was like, yes, because finally, like I said, my title then was president of the Academy's sequential art. And I was like, well, I've won the small victory on this one. But whenever I talked to, we had Anthony Marquis from the Joe Kubert School, and we were discussing. We had Bob Greenberger as well a few weeks ago. He was teaching, and it's always nice just to compare notes because sometimes I find when you do it in a vacuum, you just wonder. I wonder what others who are doing this think.
I've been very lucky at pace. I've really had what the courses that I suggested went through painlessly. Um, there is a bit of a process, but um, I'm a very odd duck as a teacher. It's when I got up from the desk and decided I would be amused to be a teacher for the last stretch of my active career. I sent letters around to a half dozen schools. Hi, I don't have the traditional credentials, but I've done all this interesting stuff. Um, and about half of them I couldn't get past the first secretary. Um, but the couple of them that invited me in got it and said, "Oh, you're that, and you can do that." And one of the things that Pace, I think, has appreciated particularly is the mix of people I know that I bring into the classroom. So I teach transmedia as one of the courses.
I figured.
Okay. This past year, when I was teaching the transmedia course, the outside speakers were Algo and Miles Millar, who were in your fine country filming Wednesday for the next season. Well, Wednesday was the most popular show among the young people the year before, so he can get those guys to zoom into his class. Well, yeah, they story edited Smallville. They're just guys. Um, so I've had people like that from the film and television world, graphic novel people, Alison Bechtel. Um, icons who helped build the field, like Lee Mars. Um, Newbery Award winner Jerry Kraft was in this year. Gene Yang's come in several times. You know, that's not something the average teacher can do easily for a class, because finding the people and finding the contact information is a challenge. It's easier now with Zoom, right?
Yeah.
Somebody to fly in, but the talent doesn't always have a lot of time on their hands.
Hmm.
And by the time you finish explaining what Taoist is, you may have lost them entirely. I don't have to explain any of that. Oh, it's Paul calling and he wants a favor. Oh, all right, we'll give him an hour. He was nice to us 30 years ago. He bought us dinner, or he sent us that paycheck express mail when we were hungry. Something, maybe. Um,
But that it is great though, as you were saying. Like I think that's the one of the few positives that came out of the pandemic was the advent, the rise of Zoom. I know this is a teacher. We deliver whole course like in the academy here. We have graduation next Saturday for the first graduating class, but some of them I don't know if they've even fully met face to face, like in person yet. I suppose that has been a great benefit. Heading into this summer, they're calling it the summer of Superman. We have a new film coming out. You looking forward to it at all? Or you will you be going in checking it out? Or do you take much interest in the films?
limited interest in the films in general,
Mhm,
because I sit there and I watch them schizophrenically. Part of me is watching with my inner 12-year-old, and part of me is, I don't. We shouldn't have done that. I mean, that violates this and that I've always believed about the continuity. Um, I was involved for many, many years in reviewing the scripts. I wasn't the primary person who worked with the creatives until Jeanette retired, but I was certainly looking at all of the scripts and giving notes on things for decades. Um, so I can't look at these things like a real viewer. But I very much hope James Gunn hits it out of the park,
mhm.
and hope to be sitting there and just smiling.
Yeah, it's been interesting and fun to see he seems to be embracing a lot of the creators, bringing them on set, giving shout outs to the comic book side of things. It seems to be a good sense of cohesion at the minute anyway between the publishing and the film side of things over at Warner Brothers. So let's see what it brings, I suppose. Um, I'm just I'm just
His
an easy sell.
heart's in the right place, but that's not always the answer.
Hmm.
It's Joel Schumacher, who is
Yeah.
much derided for his work on the Batman films.
Hmm.
Uh, Loved the comics,
Yeah.
loved the TV show, and he really came to it with a desire to do wonderful stuff. But what people like, it goes back to that what we were talking about at the beginning. How the story is received. Everybody hears the story a different way, and what Joel heard in Batman was not what the audience wanted to hear at that moment in time.
Hmm.
Um, I hope what Gunn is hearing is dead on. He's had some wonderful successes with his comic-based movies so far, so
Hmm.
fingers crossed.
Yeah. And I hope as well, now that you mentioned Joel Schumacher, that his director's cut of Batman Forever, it's being floated around that there exists a print. So who knows? Maybe we might get lucky and we can see another cut and see what that brings to us.
I'm not
Um,
sure that'll help, but okay.
I live in hope. I want to thank you so much again for your time for joining us here today, and
Pleasure.
hopefully we get a chance to talk again. And if you ever can, hopefully we know before the pandemic we were talking about popping over. Hopefully we can figure something out in the future.
Get a good budget for the school, get enough money out of the students, and send an invitation to Ireland. I'm overdue to visiting.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Thank you.
Take care of yourself. Be well.
Thanks again, everyone, for listening to today's episode with Paul Levitz. My thanks again to Paul for joining us. This is a great opportunity. I was so happy that we were able to make it work, that he would be able to come onto the podcast. If you haven't already, please check out our YouTube channel. There you'll find some videos from previous masterclasses, such as video footage from the Kevin Eastman masterclass, the Anthony Marquise from the Joe Kubert School, and Emma Kubert as well. We have video footage up. And you also find all previous episodes of today's podcast and past and present there. If you haven't already, do consider leaving a comment as well on this podcast. Let us know what you think. If you have a project you would like to spotlight, or you yourself are a creator and would like to come onto the podcast, you're more than welcome to reach out to us. Simply email us at info@taskart.com. That's TASQART.com. We're just recording today's episode shortly before the first graduating class of Task Art. That's Tala Academy of Sequential Art, located in the edge Dublin of the Avonmore Road. All students graduating from our first year have had their work published, have had an opportunity to have a portfolio review about DC and Marvel, and have also received payment in advance as well for their contributions. So that's paid published work. We're currently now opening up our interview process for new members and new students for this coming September. That's September 2025. If you would like to become a member or to become a student, either part-time, online or in person, feel free to reach out to us again at info@taskart.com, and we'd be happy to arrange a Zoom interview, or you can visit us on site as well. So if you like what you hear and would like to participate, or you have a project you want to launch, do reach out to us. Until next time, this has been a copyright production of Macaulay Consultancy 2025.